era of policing women and queer people. Do come on forward and grab a seat up at the front. I run Lighthouse Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop. Welcome to Saturday at the Radical Book Fair. This event, Backlash, A New Era of Policing Women and Queer People, will be hosted by Jake Hall and will include Keio Yoshida. Unfortunately, Cecile couldn't make it today and unfortunately wasn't able to send us a video recording of her answers. If that comes in later, then we will email it out to everyone who had a ticket. But we're sort of going to be in conversation with the themes of that book anyway. There will be time for audience questions afterwards, so we will punt it out to you. I'm just going to introduce Jake, and then the two of them are going to have a chat, and then it will be over to you, and then there will be a signing up at the back. So, Jake Hall, the wonderful Jake Hall, is an author and journalist who has been writing about intersectionality and queer culture for over a decade, and who has written extensively for publications like British Vogue, The Independent, Pink News, Dazed, ID, Vice, Refinery 29, and Slate. They are the author of the absolutely brilliant Shoulder to Shoulder, as well as a beautiful book on drag. Will you please put your hands together to welcome Jake and Keio to the stage?
Hello, everybody. Oh, nice to see you all. I got asked if I had any requests, and I said, I am Brew, and now I feel like very touristy, like sat here sipping. I got asked that question. I have zero preference. I was like, I guess, extra? Like, I don't know the differences. I think this one is, God knows, just the standard. But I do have two more cans back there. They're very accommodating at the Radical Book Fair. So I'm here with the wonderful Keio. And yeah, I actually want to ask you to introduce yourself, Keio, because I want you to lead with what you feel is important.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Keio Yoshida. I'm a barrister, and I work in the jurisdictions of England and Wales and the Republic of Ireland, so not Scotland. And my kind of bread and butter work is that I represent bereaved families in inquests. I think they're called fatal incident deaths here in Scotland. And, you know, the vast majority of the bereaved families I represent are black, and mainly the deaths occur in state custody, prisons, police custody. So that's kind of what I do in my day-to-day job. And to escape from the horrors of that, I like to write books about the law and areas of the law that I'm really passionate about, like sexual assault and LGBT rights.
I love that that's your escape. So I actually want to preface this by saying, so the book, Pride and Prejudices, actually doesn't feel, I mean, I am one of those people that tried law, could not remember all the case studies, and then quit law. And I think something that a lot of people maybe have trepidation about is this going to be a really academic book? And it isn't at all. And I think that's also partly because it reads almost like an autobiography. You do a really beautiful job of interweaving these case studies with your own experience. And I wanted to ask, was that always the plan?
Yeah, so I wrote this other book called Silenced Women with a colleague called Jen Robinson. And that book is about women who make allegations of sexual harassment or abuse, mainly against their ex-partners, and then they find that they face a defamation claim. So these are women who go to the police, they might go to a lawyer, they might go to a newspaper to tell their stories, to bring down what is often a really powerful man, although we found that actually these were not just powerful men, women were just speaking out, making comments on Facebook about an ex-partner, usually to warn another woman, and then they were being sued. And we were getting so much contact from women in that situation, and we still do, obviously, because the world has not changed. Women are still being sexually assaulted and raped all the time, that we decided to write this book essentially so that we could advise people about, you know, what would happen if you go to the police, what would happen if you tell your work and all the rest of it. And we wrote it in what we thought was a really accessible way. And then my sister read it, And she was like, oh, it's really great and a really important subject matter, but it's kind of boring. And, you know, she was like, the bits I really enjoyed from the book are when you tell people's stories, and then that way we can access it. And so when I was writing this book about, you know, LGBT rights and queer rights, I decided that the easiest way to tell a story, actually, and the most honest way, would be to tell my own story. And that would be from coming out to, you know, being a practicing trans barrister today. And I think one of the things, all the things I've learned about the law, about queer rights, are not because I studied it at university, have taught it at university, or have done it in a legal case. It's because my own life has ended up brushing against the law. So, for example, IVF equality access or being a trans parent, things like that. It's only when I've come to do something like register or get a document or something like that that I've figured out what the law is and then had to navigate it.
So you open with, so you go to Dublin and you feel it's deep shame for having never done any kind of touristy stuff whatsoever. But then you really illuminate the trial of Oscar Wilde in a way that I haven't really seen done before, because there are intricacies of that I don't feel get talked about enough. So the fact that he was a plaintiff, so he was suing for defamation. And also there was this part where you talk about how he was kind of arrested and he was being jeered at and spat on, and he was very publicly paraded for humiliation purpose. And you talk about how that made you quite emotional, and I really wanted to know how you have obviously written these books and you have worked with these people who have had these horrific experiences. How do you kind of balance the emotion of that with also wanting to convey the emotion? Because you want to convey it, but you also want to be at the point where you still feel kind of well enough to write it.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. You still want to be a human, but actually, you know, a lot of the time with the work that I do, you have to put aside the human part of you, you know, like I should have started with trigger warnings and things like that, but, you know, the nature of the work is, my job is to listen to people tell me about the most horrendous things that have happened in their life. That's usually why you meet me, unfortunately, you know, and I think my job in those situations is not to be emotional. My job is actually to say, what remedy do you want? What does justice look like to you? And for some people, that looks like going through a criminal justice system and a criminal trial. For other people, it looks absolutely nothing like that. And it's about navigating what people want.
Why is that? Why does that feel like such an important question for you to ask? Like, what does justice look like for you? Do you have people that they don't at all want carceral justice, that don't at all want to pursue that route? And if so, what is your role then? Like, how do you guide people to that conclusion, and what do you do with that when you hear it?
I think, you know, for the first book, Silenced Women, the vast majority of women who come to me or to me and my colleague to talk about something like a sexual assault or rape or sexual harassment in the workplace, they're not coming to say, I want the perpetrator to go to jail. That's, in some cases that is right, but actually in a lot of cases it is, I want him to stop. I don't want him to do this to other women. I want to be able to warn other women without having retaliation or without being sued, and doing this in a safe way. I want my children to be safe. And these are all the kind of things that we hear again and again and again. And when we spoke to journalists, when we spoke to, you know, other lawyers from all across the world, that is what we had. And unfortunately, in so much, you know, the criminal justice system or the legal system in this country, or, you know, the UK, let's say, understands justice as somebody going to jail. And so when a woman, usually a woman, but it could be anybody who suffers a human rights violation, doesn't go to the police, the first thing the courts say is, well, why didn't you go and report it immediately to the police? You didn't do that, and therefore it's not so credible. And what we try to say in this book is, and in all my work really, is that that's not how life works, actually. And also, who wants to do that? You know, who's getting sexually harassed at work and trying to navigate that system and thinks, oh, I'll immediately go to the police? And there's we interviewed, and she's a really good friend of mine. Her name's Shiori Ito. I don't know if any of you have heard of her.
Uh-huh.
But she made this documentary. She wrote a book. Can I tell her story really briefly?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Basically, she's a young woman. She goes out for drinks with a very powerful man in Japan. She then says that he sexually assaulted her. She reports it to the police, and the police in Japan make her reenact the rape out with a toy doll and with 5 male police officers standing around. And then, after that, he sues her in defamation for speaking out about this. And this takes years and years. It goes to the Supreme Court in Japan. She writes a book called Black Box, which is absolutely brilliant, or Black Box Diaries, depending on the translation. He sues her again. And now she has a documentary out where she talks about all of this. And because she was a journalist, she filmed herself going to the police and how she was treated. And if you watch that, and I know that's Japan, but I'm half Japanese, and I don't think looking at Japan is so different from what women experience in other parts of the world. You watch that and think, well, why would a woman go to the police? Look what someone like Shiori went through, and she is a middle class, educated woman with a lot of privilege.
And I guess also, because this is the thing, obviously, the law in each place varies, its jurisdiction, there are all these kind of different things to consider. But especially when you're looking at queer rights, there is a map to be drawn out, and that map has been largely drawn by colonialism. Can you talk about the impact of the way that those laws have been exported and where they remain? And yeah, I think I think it's really always worth reiterating that point.
Yeah, so I started the book in Northern Ireland, which is where my accent is from, as you might have guessed, and where I grew up. And I started it there because it was the last place in the UK to continue to criminalise homosexuality. And I was really interested in kind of why that was and what happened. And I ended up really looking into that in quite a lot of detail because I'd been instructed in a case, and I was representing, along with a legal team, someone called Rosanna Flammer Caldera. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard of her, but she is like the most incredible, one of the most incredible, I've met a lot of incredible people, but she's one of the most incredible people I've ever met. And when someone just walks into a room and they just have this queer energy, and she was wearing this brightly patterned shirt, and she'd walked in and she said, I want to sue my government, which is the government of Sri Lanka, and to go to the UN and to get them to decriminalise homosexuality in Sri Lanka. And I was like, okay, sure, let's do it. And so that's why I ended up looking at Dudgeon. But why I start with Oscar Wilde and why I look at Dudgeon and all of these is because just going through and helping Rosanna with her case is where I really learnt about the colonial legacy of the laws and about how these laws, like Section 377, were exported throughout the world, sodomy, buggery, all the rest of it. And that exists in many, many countries still. And I talk about them in the book. And I think there's a couple of points for me that are really important. One is, we've got to challenge these and continue to do so. And it's a winnable fight. It is just a massive, flagrant human rights violation. The second thing is that when we looked at Rosanna's case, it was fascinating about how equality law was used in this really nefarious way. So originally, these laws only applied to men in a lot of contexts, but in the 1990s, this basically LGBTQ rights activists like Rosanna made the argument that it was discriminatory to have laws that criminalise homosexuality, and I use that term because it's a legal term, not because I'm a fan of the term. But what the government then said is that you're right, it's unequal, so we need to criminalise women as well. So they brought in a law to criminalise same-sex intimacy between women and also to criminalise gender expression. And so that's the law we challenged in that case. And for me, it was really important to argue that equality is not equality. Equality is systemic and it is structural. And, doing something like criminalizing lesbians as well as gay men is not equality. That is something called formal equality, but it's never going to be transformative.
This is so interesting because you do see, I mean, same with Oscar, like you see these people that they go to fight for their rights and they make these points, and then when they highlight these discrepancies, then they are punished. It feels like the law loves to make a scapegoat out of queer people.
Yeah, I mean, but Oscar Wilde was also a terrible man.
Yeah.
Let's face it. I mean, I don't, but even if you're a terrible person, you still get to have rights.
I also have no comment. I'm like, yeah. Yeah, fair enough. I agree. It's so difficult though, because I feel like oftentimes when you are looking, so I write queer histories as best as I can, and oftentimes you are looking like you will have somebody who exists legally for a certain point and then just kind of disappears. And then you just kind of have to draw your own conclusions from that. But I mean, the sad reality is that so many queer histories are written through law. Like, you look at arrests, you look at rage, you look at, criminalization. It really feels like queer people often are only legible historically through law. How do you because you really inject humanity into all of these stories, even the historical stories, and I wondered if that was kind of really important as like a rhetorical tool for you to say that these people are so much more than cases. And
yeah, and I think if anybody was here for the talk beforehand,
Remy
Graves, the poet, was talking about that and how, I really felt like so much of my when I was writing the trans chapters of these books, so much of where you find trans histories is in these case files as well, and about people who've been prosecuted for transgressing legal norms. I'm really, really passionate about the fact that the law is about people, and the worst, I think when we have decisions I don't agree with in the law, it is often because you don't see the human stories in it. And what you see instead is overly technical interpretations of words. And, if you even just print out a few judgments, and if you read through them, if you're going to look at a judgment that's only talking about legal technicalities and statutory interpretation, you miss what the law is and what it does and how it works and the impact and the real lived realities on people's lives. So that's why, I want to tell people's stories.
I think also you do a really good job of explaining why laws are made and why legal decisions get made. Because, say, for example, the Wolfenden Committee, I think that's what it's called. I'm supposed to be a historian. But I think it's super interesting that you touch on the fact that homosexuality, the decriminalization of it wasn't because, people saw sense and thought that these people deserved equality. It was for another reason. And I'd love you to just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, so this is, I'm not a legal historian or a historian at all, but I think this part of our history is really interesting because people are like, the Wolfenden Committee, they made this great report, and then homosexuality got decriminalized, yay, let's all celebrate. But actually, that only really came about because people were worried that the Soviets could blackmail people, and therefore they decided that it would be better to decriminalize homosexuality. But also, what the committee did in that report is to criminalize sex work for the first time in the UK. So they brought in a law against street prostitution. So good day for the gays, terrible day for sex work. So it's also, and that's a legacy that continues. And I'm really, I think that it's a really good example about how we need to be very wary about when legal change is happening for one community, we don't throw another community under the bus, and that's an example of that.
It's also really, these are such ripe opportunities for solidarity as well. Even quite recently, I think it was less than a decade ago, but in the US there was Cheyenne Doroshow who was really passionately campaigning for loitering laws to be basically abolished. And there was this bill called the Walking While Trans Bill, and it was essentially weaponizing laws which were supposed to stop street sex work and just weaponizing them against anybody who looked like a sex worker, and trans women in the eyes of the law really fit that description. And we have seen these examples of solidarity throughout history, and we do see how these laws which kind of impact marginalized people really kind of stack up on top of one another. I think one really good example of that is reproductive justice. I mean, there was talking again about Japan, but obviously Jen Suzuki, and looking at the fact that so many trans men have to, historically have had to be sterilized in order to be recognized as men by the law. And even since the book came out, I mean, the Good Law Project they represented somebody who was a trans masculine person in the UK who wanted to conceive. So he was told basically that he wasn't allowed to do that, and that was proof that he wasn't, in the eyes of the law, a man. And I think it's super interesting, and I was so happy when I saw in your book that you've written about examples of transmasculine pregnancy. You looked at how kind of rare those are. Tell me, do you think there is now a lot more conversation about that? Are you seeing those conversations happen on a much wider level?
Yeah, so there's a lot in that. I mean, first of all, wonderful judgment from Mr. Justice Hayden we had last month on I think there's been so many really bad or difficult judgments for the trans community that when I read that judgment, it was like, oh, what? This is great. This is a high court in England and Wales, and this was the case where a young trans man who, I think, had transitioned 8 or 9 years ago, a really long time ago on the facts, applied for a gender recognition certificate, and this was turned down by the panel on the basis that he was had been trying to conceive and still wanted to conceive a child. So for me, kind of really shocking, given that we know trans men want to get pregnant, do get pregnant, should be able to be pregnant, and also kind of even more shocking because we have this really strange case law in our country from the Freddie McConnell case, which was a trans man who had a gender recognition certificate and he gave birth. He wanted to be registered as the father on his son's birth certificate, and the court said no, he had to be registered as mother, and that's because mother, according to the judge, is a genderless term in the UK. So, there's just kind of this quagmire, and I ended up actually writing that chapter because I had a child, and I could not believe my ignorance of the law, but I went to register my child. I was the one who was pregnant, and with my co-parent, my ex-partner, and I just assumed that I could be parent or gestational parent on the birth certificate, and that she could be mother. And then the register was like, what are you talking about? That's not how the law works. The person who gives birth has to be mother. And so I kind of, in the book, I really look into that and say, well, why is that the case? And then we went to Spain to register my child. And so I end up being mother. My ex-partner ends up being parent, which is also a gender term in the UK, and then we go to Spain and they say no, the terms are actually mother and mother in Spain, and the mother A and mother B, and who is mother A and who is mother B is nothing to do with gestation at all. It's whose surname goes first. So each country makes up its rules, which for me, once I kind of looked into the legal history behind it and into the case law, I was like, well, I'm sorry, why can't we have gestational parent? I don't understand it. So either loads of people in the country are going to want to be gestational parents, whereby then fine, that reflects it, or it's going to be a really small proportion of people, in which case I don't understand why we can't have that reasonable accommodation. Yeah,
reading that passage was just so, it was like watching a Monty Python sketch. It was like so maddeningly absurd. And you do a really good job of highlighting the absurdity of it, because this concept of who gets to be a parent, it's not universal. It's just so frustrating to see how wildly it can differ from place to place. And you were saying obviously that that you end up with that where you kind of want to be the parent, but then you have to be the mother. In the eyes, it's just what is going on?
Yeah, my child is going to see my her birth certificate one day, and I haven't my child understands her origin stories, but still, I understand that there may be people who give birth to their child as a trans man and with a certificate, and may not necessarily want to have that conversation and would much prefer to have, father on their certificate from the get-go, or gestational parent, which would be an accurate description, of what's happened. So I think it's my view is that we don't have the balance in the law that's correct right now.
It also just feels like such a final fuck you. It's like you've gone through pregnancy, you've gone through all of this, and then you get to the end of it, and it's like, oh, well, now we're going to call your mother. And you're like, oh my God, what else? But it is really interesting to me because I'm really interested in the way that the media can colour the language of debate. Because I was like an opinion writer in like 2016, 2017, when all anybody wanted to talk about was gay marriage. And I think everyone was focusing on faith. They were looking at ideology. They were looking at the sanctity of marriage and who it should belong to. But you make a really interesting point in there where, in this chapter specifically, you're talking about how it was purely a pragmatic decision. And I'm interested to get your thoughts on that and how the kind of gay marriage debate, what it leaves behind.
I mean, where I come down to in the book is that, as queer people, we should have the right to say I do and I don't. And, I don't know if there's any queer people out there who are about to get married, but having just been through a divorce, I would say I don't is maybe a good option as well as I do. I think it's a wonderful thing. We've got gay marriage in this country. Only 32 nations around the world have it. We should all have it. If, whatever heterosexual people can do, queer people should be able to do as well. And that's really simple. That's what marriage equality debate was all about. Having said that, though, I think for me the major problem with it has been that it kind of felt like people were like, oh, now, especially as a community, LGBTQ plus community, we've got marriage equality tick. And then what we've kind of seen is a community fracture and fall apart in a really, really sad way, I'm sure we're all in this situation where we've lost friends, or maybe we don't have as close a relationship with people because of ideological divisions within our community. And I think gay marriage actually has a lot to answer for that in this country, because of this feeling like we've achieved everything. As queers, we've got what we want, we can assimilate and move on. It is, however, I'm being light, but I tell two stories in the book of people that I met who, one of them had to adopt her own child, and the other person actually lost custody of her children. And there's a really wonderful book by Susan Gollenbeck called We Are Family about the law in the UK and how it developed. But basically she says that all lesbians in the 70s and 80s who fought custody battles lost in the courts. And one of the really, I think, difficult things I found with this book was that in the UK that it's not the case. But if you look at Constance de Bray's book, Love Me Tender, or, at the docket of the European Court of Human Rights, it's full of queer people who are still losing custody and parental rights over their children on the basis of their sexuality. So it's, for that reason, marriage is such an important protection for queer people.
I'd love to know, actually, because obviously you have such a huge knowledge of the international scope of human rights. And I really do feel like if we do continue to let the media dictate the terms of the debate, we'll just be arguing about toilets for the next 10 years. So what do you feel are the really underrepresented fights, or where do you see these key legal protections missing that you maybe don't see being mentioned or, spotlit?
Yeah, so I think that, one is international human rights law. I don't know how many lawyers are here, but you pretty much have an international convention for everything. CEDAW, women, race, CERD, disability rights, migrant workers' rights. But sexual orientation and gender identity, as it's called in international law, SOGI, there is no international convention or rights. It's like basically one of the only ones, which I think is a real, it just shows how little consensus there is in the world and how many states are still really opposed to it, which is you know, really problematic. In terms of the kind of there's a negative fight and a positive fight. The negative fight, or where the big rollback of our rights is taking place, is in the realm of free speech. And I think that a lot of times we don't think of queer speech or free speech as a queer rights issue, but if you're looking at, say, for example, the US, where you have book bans coming in, don't say gay, these kind of Section 28 laws coming, you know, insidiously back in, or even the gay cake case. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but there are these cases being brought, and I think a quite concerted and organised way, which is chipping away at service provision for queer people. So the idea is that before, the Supreme Court used to say to queer people turning up at a B&B couldn't be refused a room or a double bed together because the owners were religious. Then you have the gay cake case, and then you've had these other kind of cases. So I think that's a real kind of fight area that we've got to be aware of and stand firm. The other side of this is that I think that the most exciting area is non-binary rights. There's no non-binary recognition in the law in the UK. And I talk about the cases that have gone to the Supreme Court so far in the book, you know, where one of them, it's just totally absurd. So this person is recognized as non-binary in California, though now with everything that's going on, it's hard, but they're not in this country, which just kind of shows the absurdity of that person's situation. You have another case where there's an individual called YY. It goes to Strasbourg, and they are intersex. It's a fact of their life, and yet they lose the whole way through the French courts, and even at Strasbourg, who says, no, you have to be recognized as either a man or a woman because of bureaucratic certainty in the law. And, you know, it's totally baffling to me. And then you have these really exciting cases. There's 65 non-binary people in France at the moment who are causing havoc, and they're bringing.
I just love how that makes it sound like that's the absolute number of non-binary people in France.
They're just, you know, they're just brilliant. I'd love to meet them one day, but they came up with their lawyer with this kind of ingenious plan of taking the GDPR, you know, data protection principles, which are the most boring principles. And you know, if you want to fall asleep, read the GDPR before you go to sleep. But they brought a case against the national train operator, because when you buy a train ticket in France, you have to say whether you're female or male. And they brought a case saying, well, actually, this is a breach of their data privacy because it's inaccurate, and accuracy is one of the core principles of data protection. And they lost in the French courts, but they actually won when they went to the EU, which said, yeah, that's inaccurate. These people are non-binary. So it's brilliant.
That makes me feel like sitting through a 2-hour presentation at work about GDPR might have all been worth it.
I can organise that.
Please no. I still sometimes have nightmares. But this also makes me think, right? Because I can't remember what talk it was, but it was the kids are all right. So trans kids deserve better. Scotland were here yesterday. It was such an incredible panel. You can watch it on the Lighthouse YouTube. It's so good. But one of the kind of young activists was talking about how you should just set up your own things. And they were like, well, you know, we don't really have to go to like an AGM. Or we don't have to like get our boss's permission. And this is the thing, right? If you want to set up your own thing and you want to do it at scale, there are so many legal obstacles in your way. Like the amount, so I live in Sheffield, and the amount of volunteer-led organizations that just crumble because they now need to write like a GDPR policy. Like there are so many legal bureaucratic obstacles in the way of people who just want to make change, often on a local level, just on the ground. What advice are there organizations that those people can go to just be like, look, I need to write a data policy. I don't really know how to do it. Can you please help? Like, what advice would you give to those people who are like volunteers working at 3 a.m. looking up bloody GDPR YouTube videos.
I mean, I would say that, you know, there are lots of law firms who do pro bono work, and the bread and butter of those pro bono firms may be something like the GDPR, and that, you know, you can just get in touch with them. A lot of these firms have pro bono managers and just say, we need some help with our GDPR policy, and, you know, they might get some help. I don't think that there should be organizations in that situation. I mean, this is such a boring answer, but even the Information Commissioner's officer should have that guidance and be able to help them through that. There's somebody in the audience who wants to come in. There's a GDPR expert. Wonderful. Hello. Is that correct?
One sec. I'm going to bring you a microphone so that you can have that 2 cents.
It was nearly like Mary had planned this.
Also, thank you. You are doing the Lord's work.
Okay. It might need to be lifted over 2 of you. There we go.
I was not expecting to have to use a microphone today. So I work for the ICO, and we have a lot of guidance for small organisations. So I think sometimes people do interpret it as being quite overwhelming to comply, but we're trying to simplify it. And your point around sort of busting jargon, we're trying to make it much more human, I think, in the way we communicate. So we have an SME hub that has tens of templates for privacy policies. We have a helpline that you can talk to. So yeah, there's loads available, and if you want kind of specific pointers, I'm happy to chat about it, because it is my day job, so I can't say that it's boring, GDPR. I have to advocate for the legislation, which, yeah. But happy to chat later if you want.
Can we give that person a round of applause, please? If we take anything away from today's conversation, I want it to be that. There is help available. But I also think it's really interesting because obviously we are at a very leftist festival, and there is always this argument to come back to Audre Lorde of the master's tools and not dismantle the oppressor's house. And law is obviously, it is a key battleground, but it is not the only key battleground. And I wondered for people who are doing liberation work, who want to make change and they want to impact the lives of people, what else should they be thinking about? Like, how else do you see change being made?
My own view is that law is not a tool of liberation at all. Even human rights law is deeply problematic. It's individualized mostly. There's a thing called collective human rights, but it's very specific and on very few rights. And I mean, it's very difficult to enact systemic change with the law and just on the basis of human rights. And there's a really wonderful scholar called Ratna Kapoor who talks about this, called the dark virtues of human rights. And essentially that, you know, we as human rights lawyers might work with it, but what happens is that the language is co-opted and then can be used by states as well. And it's a very similar argument that's made by someone called Stan Cohen as well, who wrote his most famous thing was moral panic. He coined that term, but he also has this wonderful term called magical legalism, which is how states kind of frame their arguments when you bring a human rights claim against them. And it's essentially, you know, we've passed a law against genocide, therefore we cannot be committing genocide because the law exists genocide. And he says that that's this kind of idea of magical legalism. And so much about what lawyers do and what judges do is look to see if laws are in place rather than implemented, but not necessarily in any kind of substantive or transformative way. And that's his criticism. I think, you know, in terms of liberation practices, it's really, I think it's looking much more at people like the poets and the artists and the people who dream of a different world and a different future. And I think that's much more hopeful than looking at lawyers. So yeah, but buy Remy's book.
How are we doing for time, Mary?
You've got 18 minutes, so you can ask questions whenever you're ready.
Okay, cool. Is that 18 minutes left in total?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'll do one last question. Because we were chatting backstage and you said that with this book, you got a bunch of poets to just tear it apart. And I really want to know Yeah. Why? Because obviously we were talking about how poets, they need to consider very carefully every single word because you have to make impact in such a short space. But what were the kind of key takeaways and how did that shape the book as we see it now?
When I started writing Pride and Prejudices, I knew there was a problem with the way that I wrote, essentially because I've been disciplined into being a lawyer, and so I think like a lawyer and I write like a lawyer, and often that is a really boring way of kind of communicating. So I wanted to kind of work with some people who I think do the complete opposite, and each word that they write has a purpose, not for the legal purpose of technicality, but either to convey something that's beautiful or an emotion. And so that's why, I contacted the Arvin Centre and I kind of did these masterclasses. And I think that for me, the people who write the most beautiful books are poets, like Maggie Nelson or Ocean Vuong, or all their books and memoirs are just Sean Hewitt as well, to give an Irish example. Just incredible, like really accessible, even if they're talking about really difficult themes, but really beautiful. So that's why I asked some poets. But it was probably the harshest criticism I've ever had in my life. And I don't, I've been before judges who give you a hard go, but the poets are up there.
Yeah, you've made me kind of want to get a poet to read my book and just be like, look, what do you think? Because it is so difficult. And I think also, so many writers also are self-taught. I'm having that same crisis at the minute where I have been writing, but in a very journalistic way for the past decade. And then you come to this crossroads and you're just like, oh my God, like how do I make words feel alive? But I think you do it really beautifully, and it really is a very accessible book. It's also a very engaging book. And this is the first time we've met, and I feel like I already know you, which I think is the testament of a good book, to be honest. But I am going to throw it open for audience questions. I know we also are streaming live, so we might have some online questions.
Do we have any in the room to get us started? Don't be shy. Yeah, great.
Hello.
Hello.
I haven't read your book yet, but I'm about to buy it.
Thank you.
So, as you know, this has not been great for trans people here in Scotland in the last few moments. And my question to you is, what do you think is the greatest legal battle ahead when we see like erosions of rights and so on imported from the US to the UK? I'm French, so also France, and especially this whole anti-trans discourse. How can we fight it, and how can non-lawyers like me help?
Yes, should we start? There's so many different ways to answer that question. One of the depressing ways, I guess, to answer it is, well, when has it ever been great for trans people? Trans people have always had to fight for our rights and for our survival, and I don't think that makes what we're facing as a community now any different, to be honest. If you look back in legal history, I actually think potentially, and I'd be really interesting if there are other legal historians who want to pick me up on this, but there was a sweet spot, I think, in the 1940s, whereby there was no regulation at all, and so trans people, so if you read kind of the diaries of Michael Dillon, trans people were just able to go to a doctor, ask for the healthcare they needed. He just asked for hormones and asked for the surgeries he needed, also, he went to Somerset House and said, "Hi, can you change my ID?" And they said yes. And then he went back to his university and said, "Can you change my certificates?" And they said yes. So, much more complex now than it was for Michael Dillon, but much better now than it was for Christine Goodwin in the 1980s. If we look at, she was the person, the trans woman. She had gender-affirming surgery in the NHS, but was unable to change her legal documents, and she ends up going to Strasbourg, to the European Court of Human Rights, to argue that the United Kingdom was in violation of her rights. And if you read that case, which is it's a really recent case, it's from 2004, it's horrifying what she had to go through. The amount of medical hoops, the psychological and psychiatric evaluations, and also the sexual harassment she faced in the workplace. There was no laws preventing that against trans people. There was no Equality Act with a protected characteristic. So I think what I really would like to say is, yes, things are bad, but let's not remember how much the people before us have fought for and how much we have. I think the very fact that I'm able to, sit in this stage and be a barrister and have, that there are trans judges as well, I think it's important to keep it in context. There's a fight ahead, but we've always fought and we will continue fighting. The other thing is the import of ideas from the US to the UK. I think what we do have is a concerted funding campaign coming from the US into the UK, into certain organisations and in relation to certain kind of matters and ideologies. But it goes both ways. And so if you look at, there was a Supreme Court decision in the US called Scrimeti, which was heard, the decision came down this year, it was heard in December of last year, and it involved access to gender-affirming care in the US. So this was the state of Tennessee banned gender-affirming care for young people, and then there was a challenge brought to that by the ACLU and other people. And what was really interesting listening to the Supreme Court arguments in that case is how Tennessee relied upon what was happening in the UK, the bans on access to gender-affirming care that had come in the UK to justify their bans in the US. So I think it's not just all an import of what's happening in the US into the UK. I do think it is a two-way conversation, which gives us a real responsibility as well to ensure that, that what happens here, isn't going to be like the colonial legacy of what happened with homosexuality.
It's also wild to me that it's West Street and is essentially behind the puberty blocker ban. And that is like the biggest argument against representation. Like, I just don't understand it. But yeah, that was so depressing to see, like, the cast report and stuff reference. It's just wild. But thank you for your question. I wonder if maybe we have a few more?
There's another one up at the front and there's one online.
Should we maybe stack them up? So
yeah,
and then you can answer
so we'll do
both.
Milo first.
Hi. I think you were touching at it in a brief way in the beginning when you talked about people who... Oh, God, this is weird with a mic, sorry. When you talked about people whose idea of justice may not be for someone to go to prison. So I wanted to ask where and if you see a role for the law in kind of non-carceral approaches and the fight for them.
And then there's one online to go with that, which is from Sal, who says, what are collaborations between types of struggle or groups that excite you? Activists and lawyers / artists, sex workers, parents, disabled people leaning on each other. And I suppose both of you could answer the second question.
I was going to say, you're probably best placed to answer that one rather than me.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah. So I think the question was, if it's not carceral responses to the law, what does justice look like? I think that it really depends on, and this is such a terrible answer, but on the individual circumstances and the individual involved. Often in terms of a workplace, for example, where someone is being sexually harassed at work, that perpetrator just going to jail isn't the primary consideration. The person wants to ensure that they keep their job, that also the investigation is done in a humane way and in a way that is respectful. I think there's just kind of there's so much, and I think maybe it's about the there's real kind of simple change, I think, that people want as well, in terms of like a lot of people just don't have the money to even get a lawyer to advise them on what they can do and what their possibilities are. So in the realm of defamation, for example, that was one of the big issues that we saw, that there's no legal aid for defamation. So if you're sued, if you speak out, write on a Facebook wall, this man sexually assaulted me, and he sues you, well, there's, how do you get a lawyer? How do you have somebody represent you? You face bankruptcy. So the person going to prison is so kind of far down the line of all the different stresses that you're facing. So I think it's really multifaceted in terms of the changes that we need to bring about so that people can access justice and have the justice that they want.
So in terms of kind of work that I think is exciting that's been done now, I feel really excited by the Good Law Project. I just think they're doing such incredible work, and it really kind of, at least to me, appears that they're being led by charities like Transactual, which are creating these trans-led reports and this research that often slips through the cracks of mainstream media or is just completely erased by mainstream media. And I think we are seeing some kind of really exciting progress being made, like the case that we talked about earlier. I think that is hugely important. But I think also what I'm seeing is a lot of young climate activists who are just doing such cool stuff. I don't know. They're like, there are these NGOs out there who basically, their entire job is just to sue different governments and sue different kind of boards. And there's something called the Rights of Nature movement, which is where people are trying to they're basically trying to get rivers, forests represented as like a legal entity. So then anybody can actually go to court and defend this person, so they can sue on behalf of this person. I mean, you're the legal person, so maybe I'm wrong.
I've argued that in the case as well.
But I find that just wildly exciting, because it, to me, represents like such an innovative way of interpreting the law, and especially looking at natural resources. I mean, there was a group of young people in the US who sued their state for pollution. They were like, you, as a state, as a state government, are wrecking our health. And I think that is something, really interesting. We see these cases quite often of, environmental pollution and people fighting for that. But I don't think it's talked about enough that these are often marginalized groups that are really organizing on the ground to do that. But I also wanted to highlight the online safety bill, because that is something at the minute which is just suppressing, like now if you want to watch online porn, you have to like scan your face. It's just, and I had a job that was based in the US, and I was like trying to explain it to my colleagues, and they were like, wait, what? And I was like, yeah, no, you have to like do a facial scan to like get onto Pornhub. And they were like, no, that can't be right. And this is the US. Like, this is where we have, organizations like Exodus Cry launching this massive campaign against Pornhub. This is where you have, this real evangelical bent to politics. And even they think it's wild. And it's suppressing the work of so many sex workers. I mean, in the US, we had Sesta Foster, which essentially pushed sex workers onto the streets and removed online safety databases that they had. But now you also have organizations like National Ugly Mugs, which are doing really incredible work. They're based in Ireland. And they're doing this work at, like, looking at how the Nordic model actively puts sex workers in danger. And that is where I think, at the minute, we really need amplification of that. And I think there is such a massive opportunity for solidarity, because anything that is deemed, controversial or worthy of censorship is being suppressed by the online safety bill. And that includes in cases like people have access to harm reduction, like drug forums are being restricted, and we're seeing queer and trans people that are being silenced because they're viewed as obscene. And that is where I actually would love to see more solidarity work, because I still kind of can't believe that it's actually happening. But it's sex workers that are being massively harmed. It's sex workers that are leading this work. And I think I don't know, I just feel like it's not being talked about as much as I would like it to be.
I mean, I think, online harms, it's such and technologically mediated spaces of violence. It's such it's a defining topic, isn't it, for our generation and the generations that are younger. I don't know if anybody is in like parenting forums or parenting chats, or if that's just my life. But, you know, I just think that so many parents are really concerned about the online space and what children are accessing, probably because we're still of a generation whereby we didn't have the mobile phones and digital technology that we have now. When we were growing up, people weren't photographing us doing everything that we were doing. And, you know, it's a real concern about, I think, that parents have in relation to what young children are seeing. It was a concern in the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse that we had in this country, also had an internet aspect to it. And it's one of these things where it's about balance, isn't it? It's about looking at free speech and the impacts on people's lives and other rights as well. And again, I think that's just, for me, when it comes down to, is you've got to look at people's lived realities. Like, you've got to look at the impacts on these things in all different kinds of communities to know, you know, what a good law looks like. It's not an easy one.
Yeah, and it is also, I mean, again, the panel yesterday, they touched on the irony of saying, well, we should save the children, we should look after the children, and then denying gender-affirming healthcare to a group of teenagers that desperately need it. So it is also the hypocrisy, and I think the way that children and that concern is really weaponized. I mean, yeah, that's a whole other panel.
Yeah, it is.
Do we have time for maybe one or two more?
Got time for some short ones. If I remind you, a question is a single sentence with a question mark at the end.
Let's do a lightning round.
Yeah. While you're thinking, I just want to shout out Laura Bates's most recent book, which is looking at those digital spaces and the hellscape within them, and how legislation, the way that it is currently formulated, is not actually moving fast enough or thinking fast enough about the real harms, so other people get caught up in the network. And Pink Pilled is another one. Was there anyone else? Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, I'm dropping things. Do you have one piece of advice for a trans person that's not a parent yet but plans to be in 5 years' time?
Advice for a trans person who wants to be a parent in 5 years'
Yeah, who isn't a parent yet but will be.
I think that the answer to that question is quite different depending on if you're a trans woman or a trans man, I think. But in any case, when I do have young people come up to me, I certainly, if you'd asked me at 15, would I want to have a child, I would have said, no way, absolutely not. The answer to that question changed later on in my life. So I think preserving your fertility is a good idea if you have the means to do so, or if you can get it. And the other thing I would just think about as you're thinking of having a child, say, in 5 years' time, is how you legally protect your rights. There's lots of different ways to be a parent, but the law only legally recognises you as a parent in certain circumstances. And I think that's what's really important. So, for example, if you are a trans man and you want to get pregnant, and you are in a relationship with a woman, but you're going to carry and you're going to use a known donor as your as the donor, you want to probably make sure that known donor doesn't get parental rights, and that depends on the mechanisms of which you get pregnant, for example. So, whether how you do it matters, where you do it matters. So doing it DIY and in home it's a much cheaper option, but it might not be give you the protection that you need. So I would say, as a trans person, you can absolutely have a child, and you can do it in 5 years' time, or whenever you want to do it. But make sure that you think about all the different ways to protect yourself. And it could be, unfortunately, a more expensive thing to do, but it will be worth it in the long run.
I think maybe we're at time now. I'm just going to shout out, there's some stickers and some flyers on the till for Scotland for Decrim. Fighting the Nordic model is happening right now in Scotland, and there has been a call from our brothers and sisters in sex work to really show up. And also Engender have just launched a campaign to decriminalise abortion, because it is nuts that it is still a criminal act in Scotland and we just have a workaround. So those campaigns, pick up a sticker or a flyer and get involved. They're both very active current campaigns. And that leaves me only to invite you all to put your hands together and give Keio and Jake a really big thank you for being here. They're going to make their exit, and then there is a wee signing table up at the back. You can go get a book and get it signed. A reminder, we have a pay-it-forward system. So if you're too broke for a book, but you wanted the book, somebody has put money in the pot for you to buy the book. So don't leave without a book if you wanted one. And yes, that's it from me.